The telephone is connected to the telephone network with a British Telecom plug, and I simply remove the telephone jack from the telecom socket and plug it into this box here, the modem. I then take another wire from the modem and plug it in where the telephone was. I can then switch on the modem and we're ready to go.
In the 1990s, when the internet was still in its infancy, several lawsuits took place that would shape the course of the internet forever. The fact you can still enjoy free speech online is actually thanks to the 1997 case Reno versus the ACLU, which challenged the law that would illegalize the publishing of pornography online. In a way, the internet of the 90s isn't so different to the world of crypto today. It's old enough to have a direct, large-scale impact on the traditional financial world, yet young enough where the laws that govern crypto remain unclear or completely non-existent. So when we see authorities today acting beyond the powers granted to them in order to clamp down on new developments in crypto, we have to pay close attention, because the outcomes of these actions could set legal precedents that are bound to shape crypto for years to come. In August, just a few months ago on these very streets in Amsterdam, armed agents from the Fiscal Information and Investigation Service suddenly arrested a man by the name of Alexey Pertsev, much to his own surprise. We do not yet know all the details surrounding his arrest, but what we do know is that he was quickly taken by the authorities and thrown into jail where he remains today, without contact with his wife or friends, and without charges. It feels like the scene of a high-intensity crime film, one where the feds finally capture a long-sought-after fugitive. But Pertsev is not that. Pertsev is a programmer that for years has been publicly publishing open-source code, something that is typically protected by free speech laws. The code he wrote, alongside with others, became integral to the privacy tool known as Tornado Cash, an Ethereum crypto mixer banned by OFAC just days before Pertsev's arrest in August for allegedly facilitating money laundering for criminals, including by North Korean-backed hackers. And now that's what brings us here, to the streets of Amsterdam, where our search for answers continuously raises more questions. What's the real motive behind Alexey Pertsev's arrest? And is this about money laundering, or is there more than what meets the eye? And what kind of precedent might this set for developers worldwide working on open source code, for transparency in finance, for privacy, and for human rights? Pertsev wasn't the only one to contribute code to Tornado Cash, and he is said to have played no part in the daily operations of this privacy tool. So that begs the question, who really is Alexey Pertsev? And why has he alone been arrested for writing open source code? You wouldn't be able to tell from walking around on the charming streets we find ourselves on right now, but something is brewing here in Amsterdam that could have massive ramifications for the rest of the world. Ah yes, Amsterdam, the infamous red light district. Well, I'd love to give you a video tour through these promiscuous streets. That's not really allowed here, for privacy reasons. It may not officially be the law, but you can expect a proper good kicking if you try to take photos or videos of the ladies in the windows. It's the standard protocol, one that allows sex workers to engage in their work without compromising their own identity, their private life. The right to privacy is a given for sex workers here in the red light district, but elsewhere, in the realms of crypto, there's a big storm brewing around the topic of privacy, and something called Tornado Cash is in the eye of that storm. Tornado Cash is what's called a crypto mixer, and it's used to overcome the lack of privacy within crypto where all financial transactions are publicly viewable by anyone on the blockchain. Now, a lot of you may already know this, but blockchain technology is the cornerstone of Bitcoin, which arrived on the scene after the great financial crisis of 2008. That's when it became clear that even the world's biggest banks can fail, and just how recklessly these banks have been handling customers' money in private. In other words, customer trust was all but lost in the legacy financial system. Through its blockchain technology, Bitcoin promised a new way of doing finance where everything is transparent and where no one can change the data once it's recorded. Bitcoin does well to reintroduce trust back into finance, but in the process, it sacrifices something very important: privacy. There is a misconception that blockchains are anonymous, and that's why they're a magnet for money launderers and criminals. The truth is, blockchains are pseudonymous, where users are identified by their wallet address and where their transaction histories are stored for all to see forever. So if someone is able to tie a wallet address to an ID, you have that person's entire financial history before you, which can put that person at risk. Hence the creation of privacy tools like Tornado Cash, which people could use to hide their transaction history. Now you might be thinking to yourself, if you're using Tornado Cash, surely you have something to hide. And perhaps that's true, but you can also ask, is there anything inherently wrong with that? Imagine, for instance, that you are a public figure that wants to donate to a political cause that may get you into trouble. In that case, you could use Tornado Cash to send that money to that cause without it being tracked back to you. This is exactly what the Russian-born Ethereum founder Vitalik Buterin did, who used Tornado Cash to secretly donate to Ukrainians fighting against Russian forces. And actually, on that note, there would be another reason to use Tornado Cash if you are trying to donate to Ukrainians, because a lot of wallets that were openly donating to the Ukrainian cause were being tracked back by Russian hackers who then started tampering with those wallets and draining the funds. So yeah, that's a legitimate use of Tornado Cash. And here's another legitimate use for Tornado Cash. Imagine you work for a crypto company and get paid in cryptocurrency. Now imagine you want to ask your boss for a raise. They consider it, but then after going through your transaction history, they see you've spent quite a bit of your pay gambling on NFTs and buying shitcoins. After seeing this, your boss denies you of a raise and tells you to start saving your money better rather than asking for more. In that case, you may have wished you took advantage of Tornado Cash to hide your transaction history. While we've established some legitimate reasons for why anybody would want to transact privately, criminals have found another use case for it: laundering money. Seeing that Tornado Cash allows customers to conceal the source of their crypto funds in exchange for a small fee, criminals have found it to be an effective tool for laundering ill-gotten money. In an official statement, the US Treasury claimed $7 billion worth of crypto has been laundered through Tornado Cash. But that's not really true. $7 billion actually represents the total amount of money that has gone through the mixer, and 30% of those funds are tied to illicit actors. Well, that's according to the blockchain gurus at Chain Analysis. Those laundered funds include 444 million stolen by the Lazarus Group, the North Korean-backed hackers that are linked to some of the biggest heists in crypto. Hacks and heists of electronic money systems have been happening since they were invented. In fact, the biggest bank robberies of all time happened through hacks of the conventional SWIFT payment system. The difference when it comes to Tornado Cash and the blockchain in general is that we can see exactly where the money is flowing from. So the authorities can point at Tornado Cash and say, there's the culprit. There's the money laundromat. That's exactly what the US Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, has done. In August, OFAC sanctioned the Decentralized mixing service, immediately prohibiting US citizens and businesses from using the service. That means whether you have licit or illicit funds stored in Tornado Cash, you have no access to those funds. OFAC's sanctions effectively force law-abiding Americans into the same box as criminals, which one could question the legality of. In a sense, it's no different to shutting down a bank just because you know a criminal has an account there. To put these sanctions into effect, OFAC has blocked the wallet addresses associated with Tornado Cash. But wait a minute. OFAC's powers as described by Congress is to sanction people, entities, or the property of foreign persons. And Tornado Cash is not a property nor a person. It's owned by no one, which means OFAC is definitely acting beyond the powers of its statutes. The legal nonprofit Coin Center is actually planning to petition in court against OFAC's decision based on the fact that they are acting beyond their statutes. Coin Center's Director of Research Peter van Valkenburg says the odds of winning on these statutory grounds is favorable because the Supreme Court judges currently in power are what we call textualists. They believe that when Congress writes a law, they really mean what they say with each word. So when OFAC is only supposed to sanction the property of foreign persons, it means they can really only sanction the property of foreign persons. Beyond statutory grounds though, Van Valkenburg explains that Coin Center could sue OFAC on the grounds that their sanctions chill free speech. After all, open source code is protected by the First Amendment under Bernstein versus the US, and Tornado Cash is just lines of open source code running on smart contracts. And the thing here is, we don't even have to guess that the Treasury's motive is to chill free speech, because a Treasury official was officially quoted in the Financial Times as saying they want to send a very clear message to the private sector about the risks of engaging with crypto mixers.
OFAC repeatedly says the intent of sanctions law is not to punish people, it's to change behavior. And I think that's fine, and probably the right policy when you're trying to change the behavior of the sanctioned entity, right? So if it's a charity that happens to be raising funds for Iran, and and the funds are actually going to the Iranian weapons programs, then you would want to impose sanctions so the people running that charity change their behavior and they're more careful about actually moving funds to legitimate humanitarian causes or just shutting down operation altogether rather than funding Iranian weapons programs. But that's about changing the behavior of the sanctioned entity, not changing the behavior of every person who's going to use the internet. That's a radically different use of the sanctions power to say, we're not identifying an entity that we're trying to alter the behavior of. We're identifying a software tool, which therefore makes it evident we're not trying to change the behavior of the software tool because it's software, it's inert. It doesn't have behavior and the behavior won't change. It's either going to be used or not used by people. And so what they're doing is they're saying, well, we want to change the behavior of every person who might come across this software tool.
So the Treasury doesn't just want people to stop sending money to foreign accounts. They want people to stop using certain software altogether. And if OFAC sanctions didn't make that message clear enough to programmers, then the Dutch FIOD certainly did by arresting one of the main 3 Tornado Cash developers, Alexey Pertsev. We do not have a complete picture of who Alexey Pertsev is, but he's not exactly a mysterious figure within the crypto space either. For years, the Russian programmer has been publicly involved in crypto, attending Ethereum hackathons and publishing open source software under his own name, including the code he contributed to the privacy tool known as Tornado Cash. We also know that before working on Tornado Cash, Pertsev founded the company Perstev in 2018 alongside the other core developers of Tornado Cash, the 2 Romans, Semenov and Storm. Some of the foundational code to Tornado Cash actually comes from Perstev, and the company deploys ethical hackers to perform security audits on crypto projects, which is some high-level business. It's worth noting that Perstev is based out of the United States where Semenov and Storm live, unlike Pertsev, who has been based in Amsterdam with his wife for the past few years. So could it be that Pertsev alone has been detained for contributing to Tornado Cash just because he's the only one based in the Netherlands? Here in the Netherlands, one can actually be detained for writing open source code that criminals take advantage of. But that's not the case in the US. In fact, ever since the Bernstein versus US hearings of the 1990s, one is protected by the First Amendment when publishing open source software in the same way one is protected when publishing a book. That means that even if you publish code that could be fed to a 3D printer to produce an assault rifle, you cannot be prosecuted unless there's proven conspiracy to commit a crime, which could be proven if you are disseminating your code amongst extremist groups, for example. And by the way, that 3D printer example is not just a fabrication. Just a couple years ago, a Texas man named Cody Wilson actually won a landmark legal settlement against the US Department of Justice that allowed him to publish his open source code for 3D printed guns. Going back to the arrest of Alexey Pertsev, we wanted to get a better understanding of the law surrounding open source code in the Netherlands. So we paid a visit to Judith de Boer, an Amsterdam-based lawyer who specializes in cybercrime. Would you be able to give us a little bit more insight into the Dutch laws that govern the publishing of open source code?
Yes, but for criminal law, there are not certain rules that regulate open source codes. It's a question whether you can be complicit to a crime, whether you facilitated a crime by writing such an open source code.
What must the prosecutors do in this case to establish intent?
What is good to know from a Dutch perspective is that a court can only decide on the case based on what the person has been charged with. So if there's a written subpoena, the court can only decide on that written subpoena, what's the content of that. There was a press release from the FIOD saying that it had something to do with money laundering. So we have to look at intent regarding money laundering. And what we see in the case law with regard to that is that you do not need any direct proof of that you knew that the money or bitcoins or cryptos were deriving from criminal facts. But maybe one thing to add, what is interesting, that we have the Financial Intelligence Unit in the Netherlands, and it specifically said that the use of mixers is a money laundering indicator. So that will probably be used in this case as also to prove the intent.
Now would probably be a good time to tell you how Dutch law compares to American law when it comes to prosecuting someone for money laundering.
In the US, money laundering is a specific intent crime, which means you need to prove that the person you're charging with money laundering didn't just launder the money, they knew that they were laundering specific money from a specific criminal enterprise, and they intended to do that. They couldn't have just done it by accident. They couldn't have. I do not think in the US you could charge someone with, oh, you made such a valuable software tool. It's great. You should have known that some people would use that software tool to do bad things, and so we're going to charge you for facilitating those bad things.
He did not know what was going to happen with that code, who was going to use the mixers. What was the moment that he supposedly knew that his code was made use of by allegedly criminals, and what was he supposed to do then?
The contract addresses that actually do the privacy function, where you deposit and withdraw using zero-knowledge proofs, such that we don't know which addresses are putting in and taking out. Those contracts, the so-called Tornado Cash pools, those are immutable. So once they were published to the Ethereum blockchain, they're going to always function the way the code is written, as long as the EVM continues to validate state changes. Like that's just the way it's always going to be.
Everyone should treat blockchain as a Twitter account for your bank operations. It's important to preserve privacy.
The first question that comes to mind is, if there was criminal intent, why would he willingly put his name on code he wrote if he knew it could land him in hot waters with the authorities? On the surface, it would seem to us that someone who publicly puts their name on code is an idealist, one who strongly believes in the right to privacy. Of course, we do not have enough information to know for certain, but we hope to gain a bit more insight by speaking to a fellow open source coder and friend of Pertsev's, Peter Korolev. Korolev is the founder of Matter Labs, whom you may know as the engineering team behind ZK Sync. Their specialty, a scaling solution known as zero-knowledge proofs, is fundamental to the way Tornado Cash functions while maintaining anonymity.
So Alex was really kind person and open-minded. He always helped to the people on all the hackathons. He's really the guy whom I want to see more people like he in the community. It's very harmful when governments say that it's not good to be a guy like Alex.
From the Dutch government perspective, or the authorities here, the question most likely in this case is, what was Alex and his co-developers, what was their intent, right, with creating Tornado Cash? So people being worried that the intent was for purposes of criminal activity or money laundering. Even if it wasn't their intent at all, do you think they were aware that it could be used in such a way?
That's a good question, and it's very hard to say for this. Let's give an example. For example, someone who make very good high-quality knives, that they think that this knife could be used for like as a weapon. Maybe yes, maybe not. But I think it's quite obvious that something sharp with high quality can be used for bad things. Should we like ban on the knives makers?
Yeah.
No. So same thing is here. We have a problem with the privacy, and the privacy has other side, like you can use privacy for money laundering. But this is another case. It doesn't mean that we should eliminate any kind of privacy. So I think intent was like to bring privacy, something that we miss in the Ethereum.
We are here at the famous Dam Square where Peter Korolev helped organize the Free Alex protests. In general, there were two different kinds of groups present: the open source coding community concerned about the consequences of this case, and the worried friends and family of Pertsev, who, like Korolev, painted a picture of an idealist concerned with privacy. But only days after this protest, the authorities came out with an announcement, one that made Pertsev's image more murky. Allegedly, he worked for a company that supported the FSB, Russia's state intelligence apparatus' successor to the infamous KGB. According to the intelligence firm Karen, Pertsev worked for the Russian-based firm Digital Security 000 in 2017. That security firm was sanctioned a year later by the US Treasury after it had allegedly been helping the FSB improve its security apparatuses back in 2015. Commenting on the allegations that Pertsev was linked to the KGB's successor, Pertsev's wife Xenia Malik denied them fully, telling CoinDesk that she and her husband moved to the Netherlands in the hope of a quiet, stable, and free life, which is unimaginable in military Russia. For some, the allegations that Pertsev may have worked for the FSB completely changed the narrative around Alexey Pertsev from him being an open source martyr to a national security threat. Suddenly it wasn't about the future of code. However, keeping in mind the apparent motives behind OFAC's sanctions on Tornado Cash, which is to send a message to programmers, we have to take these allegations with a grain of salt. The oldest trick in the political textbook when it comes to changing public opinion is to link someone to a common enemy. And as we're seeing right now, the authorities are linking Pertsev with the FSB and North Korea in the same sentence, without offering any real evidence. Whether or not the authorities can prove Pertsev had direct communication with bad state actors, there is certain to be a whole lot of focus on whether Pertsev did or did not benefit financially from Tornado Cash operations. If he has enjoyed financial earnings that correlate to the amount of funds flowing through the mixer, well, could that imply that he intended to facilitate the laundering of money through Tornado Cash in order to earn himself money? The date is November 22nd, and we're here in 's-Hertogenbosch, also known as Den Bosch in the south of the Netherlands. This is where the pro forma hearing of the case of Alexey Pertsev is taking place. I must say, on trial day, it felt a bit surreal walking into the courtroom and seeing a freshly shaven Pertsev sitting front and center. For someone who was about to find out whether or not he would have to remain in jail, his demeanor was very calm, though perhaps he had already consigned himself to a longer stay in jail. Now, we have a video dedicated specifically to the first hearing of the case, which you can find right here, but let me give you a summary of the most important points. To start with, Pertsev is officially being charged for facilitating large-scale money laundering, a charge that Pertsev's lawyer Keith Cheng expressed frustration with because it is an incredibly general charge that doesn't take into account the complexity of Tornado Cash. The next most important thing to mention is that the prosecutor wanted to squash the narrative that Pertsev is just a developer who wrote open source code and who has no hand in the daily operations of Tornado Cash. In fact, the prosecutor Martine Boerlaasje said, quote, "This is a lie that we can banish to the kingdom of fables." As evidence, she said that between August 2019 and August 2022, the three developers Storm, Semenov, and Pertsev are said to have had daily contact regarding the operations of the Tornado Cash protocol. On top of that, Boerlaasje said that while it may seem like Tornado Cash is governed by an external DAO that votes on all decisions, in practice, The three core developers, Storm, Semenov, and Pertsev, had massive influence on the DAO, especially since they hold the most torn tokens, which gives them the most power when it comes to voting on proposals. Now, if we think back to our interview with Judith de Boer, she said that someone being tried for money laundering in the Netherlands could be charged if the facts and circumstances show that the suspect knew about potential money laundering taking place. And so it doesn't really look good for Pertsev that the investigators found messages on his phone in which he was questioned by journalists and others about the supposed money laundering taking place on Tornado Cash. The prosecutor flat out said that Pertsev knew money laundering was taking place, but that he would have had no incentive to stop it from happening because Tornado Cash would then lose a huge portion of their clients, namely criminals who funnel money through the protocol and provide a fee every time they do so. The prosecutor also said that Pertsev gets a salary from the company he helped establish, Peppersec, but that there is no way he and his wife could have been living solely off that salary, claiming that this is obvious because of their nice standard of living and the green Porsche that they owned, which has been confiscated too. Now, it's important to say that the prosecutor had the mic for the majority of this time-constrained trial, so it was quite a one-sided affair. The defense complained about this when they did have the chance to speak, and they used the time they did have to pose the question, how could Pertsev have been criminally minded if he had been so publicly associated with Tornado Cash? They also argued that Pertsev shouldn't have to be in jail for the remainder of the trial, saying that he poses no flight risk and he should be allowed to spend Christmas with his wife. Unfortunately, the judges just didn't agree, and they ruled that Pertsev must remain in jail as the investigation continues because they fear he is a flight risk and that he may destroy evidence if he were released. In truth, it never felt for a moment that the Dutch would let him be free, which gave us the feeling that the authorities are truly trying to make an example out of Pertsev. To see if our hunch was indeed correct, we reached out to Jem Adeyaman, the former Senior Policy Advisor for Emerging Technologies and Human Rights for the Dutch government.
The amount of money possibly laundered through Tornado Cash isn't that big. I don't think the government will only focus on mixers from now on, but they are making a statement. It is clear they have crypto mixers on their radar. They are looking at it. Looking back yesterday, what the prosecutor said actually, or more how prepared it was. It's a message for the developers, like, okay, you can do whatever you want. The freedom of speech is still applicable, but if your goal is something else than developing tools, privacy-enhancing tools, we got you on our radar. It's about the message. And the message is more impactful than a possible fine or something. So every developer in the world now knows, okay, I have to think twice before I put some open source code on the internet because it could have some kind of dual use.
You wrote a little piece and you were talking about the war on code has begun. Does it still feel like a war on code a few months down the line now that this case has developed?
Honestly, my opinion has changed, and luckily it did. Now, after doing more research, after hearing the prosecutor yesterday also, I quite changed my point of view. The suspect did know illicit activities were going on his platform. He was the biggest token holder on his platform. He had built in a structure, a DAO, which I said it was not, but it had a DAO governance structure, which could easily help him to make it at least more compliant, or at least put some tools in front of the mixer actually to make it more or harder for illicit activities, but he did not. So at the beginning he really went on the tour saying I had nothing to do with it, it was not in my control. But eventually, after reading more, diving deeper into the structure, the token structure also, I noticed that he actually did know what was happening and he could do something about it, yeah.
Money laundering is a problem. Oftentimes the money that comes out clean through this process goes on to fund more crime. So one can understand why the authorities would want to target a service that is allowing criminals to launder vast amounts of money. But if you analyze the actual steps taken by the authorities regarding Tornado Cash, what have they actually done to stop money laundering? The answer is very little. Ultimately, just one man has ended up behind bars, and despite OFAC sanctions, Most people, except the Americans, but including the North Korean hackers whom OFAC like to mention when talking about Tornado Cash, can still make use of the Tornado Cash protocol. So while the authorities may have targeted Tornado Cash in the name of money laundering, it feels more like a Trojan horse to clamp down on something else: privacy. And in our current day where technologies continue to spring up faster than governments can keep track of, specifically technologies that allow people to transact outside the control of government-backed institutions, publicly going after Tornado Cash appears to be a blanket statement to us all, saying that even if we don't have the laws sorted out when it comes to DeFi and privacy-inducing technologies, that doesn't mean that there won't be very real consequences for using these technologies. Of course, the Tornado Cash saga is far from finished. Groups like Peter van Valkenburg's Coin Center are set to fight the OFAC sanctions in American courts, and the Alexey Pertsev case will face another pro forma hearing in February before the real trial takes place. And while we'll certainly be keeping an eye on those developments, we hope you do too, as privacy and much, much more may be on the line.
Inventions get misused. If you make a valuable tool and you expect it to be used by people for the right reasons, just to protect their privacy while using Ethereum, and then inevitably people use that tool or misuse that tool for bad things, but those are still the minority of people using the tool, how can there be some moment there where you're culpable?